Story 1. Desert Park Ranger here. Volunteers at one of my parks called us to report a still smoldering/smoking car in one of our remote campsites. It was normal for stolen cars to get abandoned and burned. We went to look and gawked for a couple of minutes while waiting for the fire department. After a couple of minutes standing there, it became very apparent there was a body in the front seat. After an additional look around, food wrappers, rope, and numerous other strange items were found. It seems like whoever was in the front seat had been bound and shot. Police came and cleaned it up, but didn't find any answers. We refer to that as the haunted site now. It is the most popular in that tiny park. One of our cubicle farm chiefs got a call from a guy threatening to kill himself. He said he had a lot of guns and was going to end it, then gave a location close to our park. Two of my co-workers got sent out to investigate. By the time they got there, another rangering entity had found the scene first. They told my co-workers to leave before there was a ton of complicated paperwork they'd have to do. The guy had shot himself semi-successfully, then tried to walk for help. Large cleanup scene. Felt bad for the responding park ranger. She wasn't with us, but had just dealt with her husband, another ranger, killing himself the month before. She also found his body. By far the scariest thing I ran into, though. I had just moved out there and was taking care of two parks by myself, both closed. These parks are about 30 miles from the nearest occupied houses, and even then those couple of homes are usually empty in the summertime. I decided to hop in my car and drive to the darker park to take in a meteor shower and learn to play my banjo, because that is totally normal and not creepy at all. I am out there on a picnic table plucking away terribly under the stars and have this really uneasy feeling. My mind starts rattling off what-ifs. Was that a shadow? What if someone shows up? What if someone is listening and starts singing? This is the burned car park. What if they came back? As I am drowning in the silence with occasional string plucks to distract myself, I hear muffled voices in the brush, quick mumbles, then rustling. My heart dropped and my neck grew cold. There is no way this will be a normal interaction. My eyes struggle with the dark, scanning bushes trying to find shapes. The sounds grow closer and seem eerily high-pitched. Children? What the fuck? Park ranger dies of heart attack, found 3 days later still clutching banjo, will be a good headline. That was the day I learned that coyotes have the run of the desert and don't have to worry about being quiet. 3 of them bound through the creosote bushes with a yip or two, passing me close. No fucks given. That was the last time I ever played the banjo there. Story 2. I was hiking in a national forest with my wife and my dog. The first couple miles of trail led to a waterfall and swimming hole, so it was fairly well populated with people. We decided to hike past the waterfall, which involved a bit of a climb, enough at least to keep most people from going past the waterfall. We hiked another mile or two without seeing a single person. This whole time my dog was having a great time, happy to be in the woods and happy to walk 30 miles if we let her. Suddenly, in a particularly dense part of the trail, she stopped suddenly and stared straight ahead. She absolutely would not move another inch forward. We stopped and listened, but couldn't hear or see anything unusual. The dog, though, started whining and trying to pull us on the leash back up the trail towards the swimming hole. I had never before or since seen my dog act this way, but I believe she was legitimately afraid of whatever was ahead of us. Maybe there was a bear on the trail, or a coyote, or maybe a serial killer was hiding in the woods. I'll never know, because we listened to our dog and decided to get the fuck out as fast as we could. Who knows? Maybe we avoided some gruesome death deep in the woods. Story 3. I have a buddy who works long hours, but he has this pit bull mix who needs a lot of exercise. My friend takes the dog on hikes in the woods at least a couple of times per week, and he often only has time to go out at night. All my other friends think he's nuts for enjoying these night hikes, but he takes a flashlight and a headlamp, and he's this type of outdoorsman guy who usually has a handgun tucked into his waistband. We are pretty close friends though, and he'd often invite me on these hikes. Sometimes it was actually pretty nice to go tramp out in the woods if the weather was decent. This one night was weird though. This was during late winter, early spring. The weather had been warming up for the past week or so to the point where there were actually some plants beginning to bloom. But then we experienced a sudden ice storm and everything was quickly frozen over. A day or two later, the temperature was back up in the low 50s and this is when I was invited out for the night hike. Everything was wet from the ice melting, and it was a lot darker outside than usual due to the cloudy sky. We parked the car and made our way up a familiar trail that meanders along this creek through a small valley. I remember that it was unusually quiet in the woods that night. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, etc. It was unusual but didn't faze us. It was pretty nice. After making it about 2 miles up this trail, the dog just kind of takes off around a bend, maybe 15 yards in front of us. We round the corner, and he is just standing there frozen, looking off to the right of the trail into a mess of brushes, small trees. The hair on his back was standing up, and he was bent down low, but he didn't bark or make any aggressive moves. We caught up with him and kind of asked each other what was going on, and then stood there in silence for a few seconds. Then suddenly the whole forest broke out with animal activity. I think the first noise was an owl hoot, but it sounded like multiple owls all at once, maybe 3 or 4. And then the trees just seemed to wake up, and you could hear all of the birds flapping and hooting and flying and squawking around in the wetness. It felt like there were about 10 seconds of this chaotic noise, and then it all went back to complete silence. Obviously, we were both a little bit freaked out. All my hair was standing on end, and we briefly debated turning around, but just decided that things were probably weird because of the rapidly changing weather. We decided to keep going, but the dog was still frozen, staring into the brush. We took maybe 5 steps towards the dog, and then it happened. From the brush comes this fucking wail that I will never be able to properly describe. Started out like a whine and progressed to this rumbling, screeching noise like nothing I had ever heard. We both froze and stood there staring, just like the dog. And then about 5 seconds later, we heard it again. Just as loud, but not quite as long as the first. I don't even know if we exchanged any words, but within about 10 seconds, the 3 of us were headed quickly back down the trail in the direction we came from. To this day, I have no idea what we heard. I've listened to sound bites of coyotes, bobcats, mountain lions, etc., and nothing sounds like that noise. I know it was an animal that probably felt threatened, but my buddy is also the kind of guy that likes to think this was some kind of Squatch encounters. I don't believe that at all, but it was definitely the most bizarre experience that I've ever had out in the woods, and I'd prefer that it never happened to me again. Story 4, so I live near the ghost town of Elvira, PA. Back during World War II, the government claimed eminent domain and booted everyone out, built a munitions bomb factory. Fast forward to now, a chunk of the land was given back to the community as state game land. A portion of it hosts a federal prison, and a bunch of it sits unused by the government. The game lands contain the remains of the town, just foundations and wells at this point, and a bunch of bunkers. These bunkers are concrete igloo-like structures with a big metal door on one side, once used to store explosives, now used for teens to get drunk and do drugs. Over time, they have become covered in dirt and plant growth, so you might mistake it for a hill if you didn't see the door. There are local rumors that devil worshippers hang out in the game lands and have strange rituals in the woods and in some of the more out-of-the-way bunkers. I never believed these because every town has a place with devil worshipper rumors. But last year, my friend claimed it was true. He said his parents were hunting once and saw a group of people in robes around a fire, chanting as a figure wearing a deer head mask stood in the center. He also said that one time while he and his dad were hunting, he heard the chanting, singing, and saw the smoke. This particular friend is a real straight shooter, and I wouldn't think him the type to make shit up, so I'm tempted to believe him. Now, from my own experience, when I was in high school, myself and about 5 friends were all having an all-nighter at my house in the summer. Playing manhunt in the woods, shooting each other with airsoft guns, the usual. At night, we all went out with flashlights in the woods because of course we did. The woods around my house are the same woods as the game lands, and there are only 2 properties between mine and the game lands. We saw an orange light through the woods, and I was pretty sure there wasn't a house there. My friends said it was the devil worshippers and started trying to freak us out. I didn't believe in them then, and even if I did, I knew it wasn't that. But I played along to scare everyone. We went on a quest to find the devil worshippers and went toward the light. We left the path and began bushwhacking in the dark, now quite far from the house. We heard my neighbor's dog in the distance barking its head off, probably at us, but then it got really intense and made a horrifying noise no dog should make, and stopped. I've seen the dog since then, so it didn't die. We were a bit taken aback by the noise, so we all stopped and listened. In the dark, from just beyond the reach of our lights, we heard footsteps. Bipedal-sounding footsteps. Not a squirrel in the brush or a deer crashing through bushes, but a clear crunch, 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 crunch of the leaves. At that point, we all decided to head back. My friend and I wanted to keep going, but we didn't want to do it alone, so we conceded. We were all sleeping in the guest apartment over the garage, which is a separate building from the house. It has one of those 70s accordion-style doors halfway up the stairs, separating the upstairs area from the hallway and bathroom downstairs. Later that night, well after midnight, when we were settled in and starting to doze off, those of us who were still awake heard something brushing against the door from the other side. It was a flimsy plastic linoleum thing, so it was moving as something bumped it, and we could hear the noise clearly. I gathered up the courage to say out loud, "Does anyone else hear something bumping the door?" I get a few shaky yeses from around the room. "Is anyone going to get up and check it out?" Several nopes from the others, and I sure as hell wasn't going to do it. It went away after a few moments, and we eventually fell asleep somehow. Story 5. I got one from my cousin Steve that I'd like to share. Keep in mind that I might be missing a few details, and Steve could just be bullshitting me, but he seemed awfully serious when he told me. Steve is an outdoorsy person who likes to camp and hike and stuff. He never gave me specifics on where he was with this story, so it could be anywhere in a forested area in the wilderness. He said it was late September, early October, or something like that. And this was in 2004, I think. Steve said he set up a little campsite in a small clearing, no bigger than a large living room. The first night everything went fine, no troubles at all. But that afternoon, quite a while after he woke back up, he felt oddly drawn to somewhere off in the distance in the forest. He said he was like on autopilot and wasn't fully aware of what he was doing. Steve said he wasn't too far away from the campsite into the trees when he noticed what looked like a toppled over grave. That is how he described it, at least, a rectangular slab of stone. But he said it was weirdly out of place and it definitely didn't belong there. He said it looked polished, sort of glossy and reflective. There was no writing or scrawling on it. It was smooth and plain. But despite it sitting on a pile of dead leaves, there was no forest debris on it. No twigs, fallen leaves, or even moss on it at all. This was very unusual, especially considering to his knowledge, there was nobody around for miles, but it looked like it had been placed there very recently. At that moment, Steve said that he felt as though he had been picked up and dropped randomly somewhere on Earth, and had zero clue as to where he was. He said even though he could clearly make out the red canvas or nylon or whatever of his tent, maybe 25 feet or so behind him, he said he was just utterly confused and totally unfamiliar with his surroundings. Then he said that two things happened very quickly. First, he felt an ice-cold wave of air hit him. Like a cold wind on a frigid winter day, despite it being relatively warm for early autumn and there was no wine present, the branches on the trees hadn't moved and the leaves on the ground didn't budge at all. Second, he heard what sounded like a loud, deafening clap, like someone clapped their hands just once, really hard, and it echoed across the valley. Next thing he knew, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, and it was pretty dark in the woods. Only a split second earlier, it had been about 3:30 in the afternoon. Now it was closer to 8 o'clock at night in the blink of an eye. Steve said he did not see the stone on the ground anywhere, and he booked it back to his tent, scared out of his mind. According to him, it wouldn't be a good idea to pack everything up right at dusk and try to make his way back to civilization during the night, so he has to wait until morning to do so. Now, I love to say that this was some creepy alien story, like he saw UFOs flying overhead, or there was a skinwalker or Wendigo or something, because those are creepy, but that was about it. Except for one other thing. He said he barely slept that entire night. All the while, he heard a seriously creepy sound not far from the tent. Steve said it sounded like someone snoring, and it might simply just been a sleeping animal like a bear or mountain lion. Not too sure if they snore, but I guess they do. Anyway, he said he waited a little bit after dawn broke until it was fully light out. He packed up his shit and got out of there, with the feeling he was being watched the entire time until he left the woods. Story 6. Last year, I spent 2 months in the winds of Wyoming with a leadership training group. On the morning of our second day, my bowel movements were telling me it was time to take a shit. I am a devout follower of the leave no trace principle, and you should be too, which has certain stipulations regarding one doing their business. As part of this, you need to be a minimum of 100 feet away from all water sources, trails, and campsites. I gathered my trowel and bear spray and set out to do number 2. I went what I figured to be 100 feet and realized that my campsite and group mates were still in plain view through the leafless foliage, so I decided to continue on to find some privacy. After some 100 yards or so, I was well hidden from camp and began thrusting my trowel into the ground to dig my foxhole. After 2 quick strikes, it became clear that just under the bed of the forest was a layer of rock, so I decided to keep searching for another spot. I didn't want to go any further from camp, so I headed back in the direction I thought camp was. At some point, I must have gotten turned around, and I realized this after a few minutes of walking and not recognizing any of the landmarks which I had noticed on my way out from camp. This was fine, as I had found myself without my bearings plenty of times before and was always able to make it back to trail or camp or wherever. I gave the shout signal which my group had established before we set out to use as a way to locate one another. My shout was returned by the deafening silence of the forest. At this point, I should have sat down to collect myself before making any sort of rash decision. That was a huge mistake. I decided that I would go back in the direction I had just come from, and I would be able to get my bearings from there. I did so and soon accepted that I was truly lost. I had no idea how far I was from the group. I had absolutely no sense of direction and began to freak. Without thinking, I just started in a panic-induced jog in whatever direction I was facing. I was hyperventilating and could feel the tear ducts start to activate. This went on for nearly 7 hours with intermittent breaks before I sat down in a marshy kind of area with reeds and heard the familiar silence of the forest. However, the silence was soon interrupted by what I made out to be footsteps and the rustling of the brush. I stood up to see the upper half of a trail runner who had decided to run off trail. I called, but he couldn't hear me, so I took off in a dead sprint towards him, finally getting his attention. He stopped and I approached him, quickly explaining my situation. I told him the campsite my group was at when I left, and he just kind of stared at me. "Are you sure that is where you were?" he said to me. I was sure. He didn't believe me because I had ended up almost 10 miles away from anyone, completely alone, in one of the vastest expanses of wilderness in the continental US. He guided me back to the trail and sent me on my way. I made it back to camp much to the relief of my 2 instructors, who quickly sat-phoned their superiors to let them know I had been located. A full-scale SAR operation was about a half hour from commencing when I returned. That was the scariest day of my life, and I care not to imagine what would have become of me had that trail runner not been running through that particular marshland out of the hundreds of square miles and thousands of routes he could have taken. Story 7. I've done a ton of hiking in my area, mostly solo, mostly overnight. Several years ago while at college, I was stressed out and having just finished fall semester finals, so I decided to go hiking to clear my head. I went to an area I am very familiar with, and having always felt at ease there, I figured it would be a great spot to recharge. I also enjoy night hiking, so I didn't mind pushing on past sundown. But just when the sun set fully and everything turned winter gray, I started to hear things. I know those woods, I know them year-round. I know where people live, where the roads are, where the campsites are, where locals go to smoke weed and get laid, and that those are the places where you run into trouble if you don't have a car. I started hearing bicycle bells, chimes, clicks, and voices that couldn't be there. I assumed it was like a white noise hallucination brought on by stress. I acknowledged hearing them to prevent denial from exacerbating the issue. Stress was manifesting a different way than usual, so I just let it happen and hoped it would pass. Soon after, the peripheral vision hallucinations began. I am used to some weird shadows and my brain making up things in the blending gray of twilight. That part is physiological, not paranormal. I acknowledged that and continued, wanting to make it to some pioneer cabin ruins to camp. I had stopped to eat lunch there once and thought it would be an inviting place to hang a hammock. The auditory hallucinations changed to voices, which bothered me. The visual hallucinations, previously only present in my periphery, began to linger when I focused my eyes on them. Then they began to move toward me. I closed my eyes to try to reboot my vision and center myself, but my eyelids may as well have been glass. I could see right through them and could still see the gray woods, gray figures, and gray houses as well as if they were open. So I prayed. I asked for clarity and protection. I received the reply immediately, knowing that I would be watched over until I left the woods, but only if I left soon. The mountain I was on was the highest in the area and in the edge of the escarpment to the Blue Ridge, so there was some cell signal to be had. I knew I didn't have time to walk the 12 miles back to my car, so I called a friend to come pick me up. The trail intersected the road at the top of the mountain, so I hiked along the road for a few hours before he got there. I've been back to the woods, even to that part of the trail, and I feel safe there. I still see peripheral figures at twilight. Despite that, I still prefer to hike by myself, but I know better than to think I truly hike alone. Story 8. My dad and stepmom had recently bought a retirement home in the Southwest and had been living there for a few months. Dad loved the idea of BLM land to hike on. Back home, everything worth hiking is privately owned and they'll shoot you for trespassing. He found a few spots and had quickly scouted them on his own, but hadn't explored them in full yet. Stepmom wasn't the hiking sort. We decided to take the family and visit them for spring break week, which finally gave Dad some hiking buddies to explore with. He was super excited about everything and very eagerly suggested one spot he had been too nervous to do alone so far, a place that had some cool natural rock formations. It sounded like a great idea, and it only took about an hour to get to from his new house via paved roads. We all jumped into his 4WD truck and headed out. It ended up being a very beautiful area, and we pretty much had it all to ourselves. We explored a bunch of stuff until around dinner time when the kids grew hungry, and it had also started to rain. It had been a fairly uneventful day so far, and we had hiked, explored for many hours, so we decided to drive back to his house. Dad decided he would take a scenic back road to get home. My dad had always had a very good sense of direction, so we didn't question it whatsoever. After a while of driving, however, it was clear that the road was not much better than a pothole-ridden two-track, winding through the muddy hills. We started wondering if Dad had early-stage dementia for choosing this awful road. There were some spots where the road was very dangerous, especially with the rain. The truck kept slipping on the hills and our maximum speed was around 8 miles per hour. It got extremely nerve-wracking. It was also taking forever at those speeds and the sun was setting. Our kids kept asking, "Are we there yet?" like Donkey does to Shrek. Oh, and did I mention that we didn't have any cell service the whole time we were out there? After driving well over an hour on this two-track, we came to a crossroad that wasn't on any map. It was now just past sunset, and we were concerned about driving through this unknown area during the dark. Unsurprisingly, it didn't take long to weigh the pros and cons of taking the mystery road. It was clearly in much better shape than the two-track and didn't appear to be anyone's private driveway or anything. So we decided to take it to save what was left of the truck's suspension and hopefully get everyone back to Dad's house before full dark. We hadn't seen another car or person since we left the hiking area, but we did see some free-range cattle and the road had widened, so we felt better and better about our decision to take said unnamed road. The sun had sunk deep below the hills and the sky was quickly changing, as it does in the desert at night. But we could see something on the horizon, dead in front of us, that looked like a cloud. As we drove on, the cloud grew in size, and we all realized something was on fire. After just another mile, we could also see flames. It was a house on fire, or rather, a trailer house / mobile home. It looked like someone's permanent residence, sitting about 150 yards away from the road. We still didn't have cell service. None of us. By the time we got to a well-used driveway in front of the fully engulfed home, we could see other signs of current habitation. A mailbox, a second house trailer not far from the one on fire, a sedan parked about 100 feet from the blazing inferno, a small tractor, a windmill, a shed. Dad and I got a very bad feeling. There were no houses anywhere nearby. We hadn't seen another car or soul in hours. We couldn't get a signal to call 911. If someone was trapped in there, we might be their only hope. My dad screeched to a stop, threw the transmission into park, and without needing to say a word to each other, he and I decided to jump out, leaving my husband, kids, and stepmom behind in the idling truck at the end of the driveway. Dad and I could instantly feel the heat on our faces, even 100+ yards away from the blaze. The roar of the fire sounded like a freight train, but there were no other sounds. The sky was now pitch black, and it looked quite at odds with the incredible light emanating from the inferno. The flames had to be at least 30 feet tall. Dad and I jogged up the driveway yelling, "Hello? Anybody there? Is everyone okay?" And that's when we heard the blood-curdling screams. Upon hearing the wailing voices, we looked at each other for a split second and instantly broke into a full sprint towards the fire. We ran as fast as our legs could go. It sounded like two young children, maybe behind the blaze somewhere. They screamed over and over. And we were yelling back, saying things like, "We're coming! We will help you!" when we heard another voice, a man's voice. We were probably only about 20 yards from the house and were holding hands in front of our faces because of the heat. We couldn't see him at first, but then he seemed to materialize between the fire and the shed. He was calmly standing off to the side, approximately in the same direction as the screams. The firelight made it hard to see him clearly, but he looked like a middle-aged white guy, thin, wearing jeans and a long-sleeved shirt. He was also holding something long, like a shovel or a rake or a stick. Or maybe a rifle. No, it was a rake, certainly. Or, gee, we couldn't tell. But it made us freeze in our tracks. His voice seemed very calm, and without shouting, he could clearly be heard over the roar of the fire. "It's all right, those are my birds," he said, and just then the screaming stopped. Dad and I stood there dumbfounded for a second. The man repeated, "It's all right, I have this under control." And just then I heard another scream, and it really did sound more like a bird now that he said it. This bird scream was followed by a very clear and normal-sounding peacock call, emanating from the same direction as the previous screams. It clicked for us. By this time, if anyone or anything was still in that house, they were long past saving. And those screams did kind of sound more like birds than children. "Okay," my dad said. "You sure you're okay, sir?" "Yes," the silhouetted man very calmly said after a few seconds. "Everything is fine. Thank you for stopping to check." We got the distinct feeling he did not want us there, and he was still holding the rake in his hands. So after another awkward silence, we cautiously took several backward steps, then turned and quickly walked the 150 yards or so back to the truck. We didn't speak to each other on the walk. It was like we were both too afraid and shocked to process it all quite yet. We quietly got into the truck and were peppered with loud questions from our family. I remember neither of us answering, just fastening our seatbelts and my dad trying hard to nonchalantly not peel out of there. We both felt very uncertain. As we drove back to Dad's house, we all talked through the details and pretty much talked ourselves into believing it was just some random guy calmly watching one of his trailers burn to the ground for whatever reason. So had we basically walked into a crime scene? Surely not. No. Being not from the area, I left it to my dad to alert the authorities once we got back to his house. We followed the news for weeks afterward. No missing persons and no foul play. I hope to this day that it was just some lonely hermit and his peacocks and tropical birds, but I think I'll always feel unsure.